The AVSA Library Committee is pleased to present this educational video of a walkthrough of the Design Division of the 2016 AVSA National Show in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is Part 2, the Interpretive Flower Arrangements, designs in which African violet blossoms are used in the design. Following the judging of the show, Paul Kroll and B.J. Ohme, both nationally recognized designers and judges, provided a recorded walkthrough and critique of the Design Division. Their diplomatic comments are intended to be an instructional and educational tool to teach design concepts and techniques to our viewers.
Welcome to the 2016 AVSA National Convention in Albuquerque. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Paul Kroll and Mr. B.J. Ohme, who are going to be going through the Design Division again with us and giving us some good, important critiques and comments on the design entries this year. So welcome, Paul, and welcome, B.J., and thank you very much for taking the time to do this with me.
You're welcome.
And so who's going to start us out and tell me what we're doing today?
Well, I'll start by saying that this is not intended to be a post-mortem on the judging, nor is it intended to disparage any of the designers. It's a critique on the designs themselves so that other people can learn from it to do more with their designs and how to execute them according to the schedule.
Great, thank you.
For viewers' convenience, the design walkthrough video is divided into 3 segments: interpretive plant arrangements, interpretive flower arrangements, and container gardens.
Now we come to the interpretive flower arrangement section of the design section and division, and we have some smaller designs. These are raised up from the tabletop, which helps a lot for everyone looking at the designs. It instead of looking down on them, it raises them almost to eye level and makes them much more easily viewed.
These smaller arrangements for designers, I think, are some of the more challenging ones to get the proper proportion and scale, because you have such a small area to work with. And we'll see in some of these maybe where they could have been improved, where maybe not as much material and accessories and line material went into the arrangement.
This class is titled Fetishes, and it says Native American fetishes are representations of Native American animal symbols, carved typically of wood, stone, antler, bone, or shell, and represent spirits of animals or forces of nature, staged in a white niche, 8 inches high, 8 inches wide, and 8 inches deep. It's quite rare that we have niches that are actually square. They're usually a bit oblong or not as deep as they are wide, whatever, but this was a block-shaped niche. The first one here is quite stark. The exhibitor chose to use feathers as line material and so forth. The violet doesn't pop out at you, but it's there. This next one, there's a glass piece here that looks like a butterfly, and I think that's what it's supposed to be.
Right.
And
Andrea, also, if you can zoom in on this one, they've also used
I tried to get the little bumblebee
accessory of a bumblebee.
Obviously using insects to interpret the fetish.
Right.
Okay, this next one is very colorful, with the blossoms really popping. They're quite far forward in the niche, and we wondered whether this ribbon up the back, for lack of a better term, with the American or Native American symbols on it was really necessary, but that's the exhibitor's choice. Again, this is one that I'm not going to move this because I think I might damage it, but this is one that I think, again, would be greatly improved if the design were turned slightly at an angle. The next is nicely done with an owl as an accessory. The container is pretty big for this size niche, but it's of a color that doesn't pop out at you. Whenever you use evergreens of any kind in a design, you have to be very careful to trim them because they're always heavier than you want them to be. And I think the greenery here is a bit heavy. Could have been enhanced the design if it had been trimmed a bit.
This next design has chosen to use the container as their interpretation of the theme. You also see something interesting here with the backdrop, how they haven't covered the entire backdrop, which gives it a different perspective and a different look. And this designer has also used a tiny accessory, which helps to get their point across, but not in a way that detracts from the actual design. And I like the way that the African violet, the color contrast between the backdrop and the components of the design and the African violet really complement each other. It really makes it stand out.
The next entry is almost what we would call monochromatic in purples and lilacs shades. The accessory there is a little bear. Am I seeing that correctly?
Yes, it looks like it is a small bear.
Yeah. And a nice way of making the design itself pop by using lilac against the dark purple. Only one blossom, but it works. And this next design is problematic to us. I'm sure it was to the judges. It's a shell with the violet in it, but here's an example of a very stark arrangement because it has no backdrop, no underlay, and no height. It's just right. a large clump in the center of the niche.
This is an example of the scale and the proportion of a small arrangement. It's just, as Paul was trying to say earlier, you want to have about 7/8 of the total height.
But it got a blue ribbon.
It did get a blue ribbon, and that's...
Would you agree with that?
Well, we said earlier, this isn't this video, the purpose of this is a teaching tool, and we don't want to do a post-mortem on the judging. Let's just leave it at that.
Go ahead.
This next section, this next class is entitled the Rio Grande River.
Can I stop? I'm sorry.
This next class is entitled the Rio Grande River, and it says the 5th longest river in North America, flowing from the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado to the Gulf of Mexico. An underwater design not to exceed 12 inches in any dimension. No backdrop or underlay is allowed. Limit 10 entries. When the library committee was taking still photographs of this class earlier, one of the members held a white foam board behind it, which really helps a lot to enhance the design. Unfortunately, when we have underwater or any other freestanding designs, we always seem to have to put up with fire alarms, exit routes, flocked wallpaper, whatever, and so you'll have to overlook that as we talk about these. One of the things I think is remarkable about this class as we go along is that no two containers are alike. We often see several containers that are alike, and none of these are, so very nice. Some really nice designs, starkly done.
When I look at this whole class, I think the designs are very clear, they're neatly done, but maybe the interpretation doesn't really scream the Rio Grande River to me, and I think that's important in putting the designs together. I think when you get down to the end of the class and see which one was chosen as the best in the class, it maybe interprets the theme the best out of the group.
Keep in mind that interpretation is only worth 15 points in the judging of designs. The design itself is worth 40. This exhibitor has chosen to use some marbles at the bottom. Sometimes they can detract. These sort of blend away. They're not detracting, but you don't have to have anything at the bottom of the design. It can be just the design itself stuck to the bottom of the container. Here, the greenery is the overall accessory, or whatever this white thing is here is a piece of stone or coral, is a bit heavy. My wife always says white adds 10 pounds, and if you use white in a design, it makes it very heavy, and the greenery is heavy as well. This next design is an oblong and quite stark in the center of it. They chose to use, again, a piece of coral or something in a shell, and then some greenery. But there's a lot of sand here that I think detracts from the overall design.
I think this design, I mean, with the cow skull and the sand, to me, it does a good job of interpreting the class. But maybe there's a lot of extra space that could have been filled in the container. It's almost like there's not enough design there.
Didn't fill the niche.
It didn't fill the niche. I think this next one does an excellent job with the container. I can see the movement of maybe the river, the way it winds through the canyons there. The blossoms are used very clearly and neatly. And then this designer has also used holly leaves, which is an unusual component, maybe something that we don't always see in design shows, but they've done a good job with this one.
And I noticed this is also placed at an angle slightly. Is that typical for an underwater design?
It's the choice of the exhibitor.
Right.
Okay,
I would assume the exhibitor had that in mind when they placed their container there.
And this last of the underwater designs is a really neat container and nicely placed, nicely designed Chimera Blossoms that pop.
This is an example too where, as a designer, maybe we're told not to use blossoms that have white in them, not a pure white blossom because they go down. But this is an example of where there is some white in the blossom, and contrasting stripes on the petals really make it stand out fine. It's holding up fine.
The purpose of underwater designs is for magnification. It creates a lot of interest. Visitors who come to the show to look at things, often we find them sticking their finger, which they shouldn't do, of course, touching, but they want to stick their finger in to see if that's really water or what's going on in there. So.
And for anybody wanting to try an underwater arrangement, maybe for the first time, something that I look at here is all of these containers are flat-sided. If you would have a curved, maybe like a bubble bowl type container, you're going to get major magnification of your blossoms and your line material that you use in it. So it can be done, but it's tricky.
We all, as designers, we use distilled water as opposed to tap water because the distilled water usually lasts best without making the material bleed, but you always have to test your materials that you plan to use so that you know it's not going to bleed into the water.
And can you tell me what you mean by test the materials, please?
Well, try it at home and see what works for you with the blossom and the line material and so forth. So
in other words, put it underwater?
Right,
Yep.
Maybe you have this piece of wood, and if the designer maybe hadn't tried that out at home first by suspending it underwater, maybe it could have had particles or bark that would come off of the piece of wood and float up to the top or make your water real murky. So it is important to test that out. And I think maybe for somebody that's not familiar with underwater design, you might be thinking, how are they getting that to stay suspended or anchored like that without floating to the top? And there are many different ways. Some people use hot glue guns. Some people use small pin holders. Some people use floral clay. So there's all different manners and tricks to these.
Okay, go.
The next class is entitled White Sands National Monument. Gleaming like Arctic snow, great wave-like dunes of gypsum sand show a magical presence of life. 15-inch high niche by 11 inches wide and 8 inches deep.
I think this is an example of, well, number one, the blossom has started to go down, but maybe a larger blossom. This designer has beautiful curving line, but I'm not quite sure about the choice of the backdrop. Maybe a different color backdrop, maybe a light blue, something that's a little bit more compatible with the red blossom.
And this next entry has a textured backdrop and underlay, which is interesting. I guess maybe it's to depict the heat waving off the sand, rising off the sand. And again, this is one that we felt would be much enhanced by slightly turning the design, because it gives much more depth.
Right. That's another thing where maybe try, when you're just working on an arrangement or a design, just to start your material to the back and move forward. It's straight up and down. Maybe a little bit more transition material here, so we're not just seeing these long stems, but try to get more depth instead of just straight up and down.
Did we move that back?
Yes.
Okay.
This next design is an example of the exhibitor taking liberties with the niche. The sides of the niche are at an angle here, and I don't think it was an accident. I think the exhibitor wanted it that way because the cloth base they used here to cover whatever anchor they had, it comes out beyond the measurements of the width of the niche. And I'm not sure if that's appropriate or allowed, but it's a very nice design with the curves, white against white, but still.
Can I ask you if there were any comments on the card relating to that issue?
None.
Okay.
This next design, the exhibitor chose to use a succulent material, which is allowed, of course. That's the kind of plant that might grow in the desert. And it says white sands and blue sky, and that's what the designer decided to use and do. The next entry here chose to actually use sand in an interesting way at the base with no backdrop or underlay. What does
the comments on this one say, love the contrast between the blossoms and the sand, creative use of the sand, but lacks distinct line and has poor use of space.
And can you elaborate on that a little bit,
Well, that's
please?
kind of what we talked about, the one earlier, where it's pretty much straight up and down without a lot of depth, or transitional material. It just needed a little bit more weight in there. But they've done a fabulous job here with the sand to get their interpretation across. And also the blossom, maybe if there were some more use of more than one blossom up here higher, because your focal point is clear down at the bottom, which makes it very bottom heavy with all of the sand in your blossom, and then it's very light up at the top. This next design has used the white ribbon as their line material to interpret the movement of the white sand. But here again, where all of the blossoms are placed at the bottom of the arrangement, maybe we felt like if there was some more greenery or more transitional material here, and maybe have the blossoms throughout the design, wouldn't put your focal point all the way to the bottom. And maybe almost, I don't know, what do you think, Paul? Maybe a different color of blossom. They're almost lost.
They're almost
to me.
lost. The purple bloom is almost, although it has a slight white edge, but the purple bloom is almost lost against the dark blue.
This would be an example of where we're standing a foot away from the design and critiquing it. You know, if we stood back, I'm not sure it would really stand out as much.
The next and last entry in this class uses greenery again, evergreens of some type. Looks like taxus or yew. And I believe that, you know, it's too heavy. If some of these branches or whatever had been trimmed out, it would have been lightened the design and made it much more elegant. And here too, the colors of the Chimera Blossom of red and white against the flesh-colored or peach background is an odd choice of contrast, I think.
And here again, this designer has chosen to put their African violets right at the very bottom of the design, and it really needed more up throughout. We'll read the judges' comments on this. Fresh greenery needs more distinctive line, and the blossoms were wilted, so it is important to condition your blossoms or make sure that they are in good contact with water.
Here's an example of the wings of the niche having splayed out, but I think it's just something that happened because it won't stay where it belonged. So the next class is entitled Old Town Albuquerque. Old Town is a historic district in Albuquerque dating back to the founding of the city in 1706. Staged in a white niche 20 by 16 by 12. Beautiful pieces of wood, heavy line material. I'm not sure that the little wrought iron chair at the back was necessary, but it is fairly well hidden. It's not right out bold in front of you.
Right. I maybe would suggest a more bolder color of blossom. These blossoms for the big heavy piece of wood and the large piece of line material almost look lost, like they're not maybe quite large enough for clusters of flowers.
That was the only entry in that class. The next class is entitled Georgia O'Keeffe, who is an artist. She painted beautifully with color where there was none. Staged in a white niche 22 by 18 by 14, and the exhibitor has chosen to use a picture frame inside the niche with some interesting line material and very bold colored blossoms against a bold colored backdrop. Very effective, interpreting the theme very nicely.
The next one also has a lot of interesting material here that they've used to create a really beautiful line. I'm not quite sure that we're getting enough color in this one. Maybe if a darker piece of material had been used instead of the white. But the blossoms do show up very well. And then this designer has also done something that I haven't necessarily seen before, but they've used African violet leaves as part of the design, which is really creative and something new that you don't see all the time.
This is quite a bold arrangement with the split leaf philodendron and then the blossoms in the center. They really pop against the dark green and the black backdrop.
I really think the black backdrop really makes this stand out a lot.
The the next class, the last in the flower arrangement section, is called Albuquerque Hot Air Balloon Fiesta, the once-a-year, week-long event of 650 hot air balloons that fill the sky. A colorful hanging arrangement. It does not, it says designers provide their own dowel rods or mechanics. And this is a large niche, 24 by 20 by 14. And it says hanging arrangement, but it does not say mobile. It does not say anything further. So it's just a suspended arrangement that's hung from the dowel at the top.
I think this designer has done a good job of using the entire niche, where you get the sense that the hot air balloons are starting at the ground level and rising. Lots of movement. This next design actually got a red, and we're going to read the comments. Great idea. Like the framework. Would have harmony of blossom colors to make open space, and it lacks a focal point.
Well, not every design has to have a focal point. If you choose to have an abstract design, the definition of abstract is not having a focal point. So that's the designer's choice.
Go ahead.
The next entry in this class, it chose to make it a mobile. It really moves with the movement of air. The design really moves. I can make it do so now. It's not going to. There we go. And it's quite interesting. And yet, as the mobile moves, it does not come out beyond the measurements of the niche. The balloons themselves are quite wildly colored, and the blossoms are pale in comparison to the balloon colors, but it got a blue ribbon.
Yeah. And this designer has done a fabulous job of getting these balanced,
yes,
which is not an easy task. So kudos to them.
This design has not stopped moving since it was put together, and it's really quite interesting. The blossoms here are darker, and the balloon colors are muted with the what kind of material?
Tulle.
Tulle material, yeah, that's covering them.
Material.
And quite interesting.